Welcome to our deep dive. This time we're tackling uncertainty.
Yeah, uncertainty.
We've got excerpts from this book, really digs into how uncertainty shapes us, how it affects our lives, our choices.
It's a big one, isn't it? I mean, as humans, we're practically wired to try and predict what's next, right?
Yeah.
But the world, well, the world doesn't always play by our rules.
It's like our brains are these prediction machines, all set for survival, but in a world that was way simpler than what we deal with now.
Right, exactly. And the book, it actually starts by looking way back, like ancient civilizations. You know how they often thought uncertainty was, the gods messing with them.
Yeah, like it was a flaw in how we understood things, not like a basic part of reality itself.
Right, and it's funny, even the Greeks, they loved their gambling, games of chance, but they never sat down and worked out a real theory of probability.
That is wild. You'd think with all those dice games.
You would. The book suggests maybe it was their number system. Imagine trying to work out all those odds with Roman numerals. Yikes.
Oh, that's a good point. And speaking of numbers, did you know, like fear of forgery? That actually held back those Arabic numerals, the ones we use now, in Europe for quite a while.
It's crazy how these things connect. It wasn't until printing came along that those numbers became widespread, and then bam, breakthroughs in math.
Including probability.
Exactly. But even then, it's funny, the first push wasn't some pure love of knowledge. It was gamblers wanting to split the pot fairly if a game got interrupted.
Humans, always finding a way to make learning fun. But those tools, they got more powerful, right? And then came this idea that we could, quantify and predict human behavior itself. The book talks about the Enlightenment and this belief that, society could be understood through numbers. Kind of like today with those algorithms trying to predict everything. Elections, what we'll buy.
It is a fascinating parallel. But remember David Hume? He had this whole problem of induction thing. Just because something's happened a certain way before doesn't mean it'll keep happening that way. The future, it can surprise us.
It's so true. Especially now, things change so fast. It's like using landline data from the 90s to predict how we use smartphones today. Totally different.
Exactly. Past patterns aren't always a reliable guide. And that leads to one of the book's big points, the difference between risk and uncertainty, a concept developed by Frank Knight.
Okay, let's break that down. So risk, that's when we know the possible outcomes, right? And we even know how likely each one is, like rolling a die. You know the possibilities are.
Right. But uncertainty is the wild card.
We don't even know all the possibilities.
Yeah.
And we certainly don't know how likely they are. We're in the dark.
You don't even know what we don't know.
The book's example about Obama and the raid on bin Laden's compound, that really hit home for me. It was high stakes, very little intel, nothing like figuring out the odds of a dice roll.
Totally different. And it shows how risky it can be to try and use probabilities when we're dealing with the truly unknown.
So how do we even approach a world where these unknowns are becoming more and more common? It feels like we're swimming in uncertainty.
Well, the book suggests that we need to recognize the different types of uncertainty we encounter because they each come with their own challenges. For instance, there's what they call stationary probability. That's where those past patterns are pretty reliable, like the effectiveness of a medication you take regularly.
Okay, I get that. You expect it to work the same way every time based on your past experience.
Exactly. But then there's what the book calls Heraclitean uncertainty, where things are constantly changing so the past isn't as helpful. Like trying to use a map from 10 years ago to navigate a city that's been totally rebuilt.
It's like the ground is shifting under our feet.
Exactly. And then there's chaotic uncertainty, where tiny differences can lead to totally different outcomes. Think of weather forecasting. The further out you go, the less reliable it gets. Because even small changes in the starting conditions can have huge effects.
And then, of course, those unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know we're missing. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where you don't even know how many pieces there are.
Exactly. And this leads to another issue the book raises. It's not probability itself that's the problem. It's the word probability. We use it in so many different ways, often without being clear about what we mean. And that can lead to a lot of confusion and a false sense of certainty.
This is where it gets really interesting to me. We throw around probabilities all the time. There's a 70% chance of rain. But what does that even mean? Is it based on hard data? Or just a gut feeling dressed up as a number?
That ambiguity can be misleading, especially when we're dealing with really complex systems. The book argues that this often leads to an over-reliance on models that, they might be built on shaky ground. Like, we're putting too much faith in something that might not be as accurate as it seems.
Which brings us to a fascinating paradox, right? We live in a world that's more uncertain and unpredictable than ever. Yet, we're bombarded with these incredibly precise predictions. And often, they turn out to be wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Like that time when a recent high-profile prediction that was wrong and related to the listener's area of expertise. It shows how easy it is to mistake the model for reality, to forget that these predictions, they're just tools. They're not the real world.
So, how do we deal with this? Our need for certainty, clashing with the reality of the unknown. It feels like a constant battle.
It is. And the book, well, it suggests a really thought-provoking idea. Maybe we shouldn't fight uncertainty. Maybe there's an upside to embracing a little bit of the unknown.
Now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about this upside.
Well, imagine a world where everything was predetermined, predictable, no surprises, no chance encounters. Would you really want to live in a world where every joy, every disappointment was pre-programmed?
That's a great point. I think I'd get bored pretty quickly.
Exactly. It's the unexpected twists and turns, the moments of serendipity. Those are what make life interesting. They give us stories to tell.
I can see that. But how do we balance that with our very human need to plan, to feel in control? Those are powerful instincts.
They are. And that's where the book uses this really helpful analogy. It compares models and forecasts to maps. They're useful tools for navigating, but they're just simplified representations of the territory, not the territory itself.
So it's about recognizing those limitations, right?
Yeah.
Not mistaking the map for the actual terrain. That makes sense. But what about when we have to make decisions under uncertainty? How do we navigate those situations without relying on predictions that might be flawed?
Now that's where things get really complex. And that's actually what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
I am ready to dive in. This conversation is already making me rethink my whole relationship with uncertainty.
We'll be looking at how this plays out in our actions, why we do what we do, where we choose to do it, who the key players are, and of course the importance of timing in a world full of unknowns.
Stay tuned, listeners. We'll be back soon with part 2 of our deep dive into the fascinating world of uncertainty. Welcome back to our deep dive on uncertainty. Last time we got into how humans are wired for prediction, but the world, well, it throws us curveballs, right? Those unknown unknowns.
Exactly. And now we're going to dig into how all this plays out in our actions and choices, right?
Yeah.
How uncertainty shapes what we do.
The book dives into 4 main areas: why we act, where we act, who those actors are, and the timing of it all. It's a lot.
It is. It's fascinating stuff, though. So let's start with why we act. How does uncertainty actually influence our decisions or motivations?
Okay, yeah. Because a lot of those traditional decision-making models, the ones you learn about, they kind of fall apart when you look at the real world, right? Like, they assume we can make choices in a vacuum, as if our actions don't ripple outwards.
Right. We're not isolated actors. It's more like, that butterfly effect idea. Even a small choice can set off a whole chain reaction we never saw coming. Like, the book used this example of a bank run.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that. So imagine you hear rumors your bank is in trouble. From just your own point of view, taking out your money seems rational, right? Protect yourself.
Yeah, it makes sense. Get it while you can.
But if everyone does that at the same time,
Uh-oh.
it triggers a collapse. And then everyone loses out, even the people who thought they were being smart.
It's a great example of how interconnected everything is. Our choices, they have consequences far beyond just us.
Exactly. But what about where we choose to act? Does uncertainty play a role in what places, what contexts we gravitate towards?
Oh, this is where that idea of contingency comes in, right, from the book.
Right. The idea that, well, sometimes these tiny events, choices that seem insignificant, they can have a huge impact on our lives, put us on a path we never expected. It's like, I remember that time you recall a specific anecdote from the listener's life where a chance encounter or seemingly small decision led to a significant change in their career or personal life. It makes you wonder, right? How many turning points in our lives happen because of these little unpredictable moments, things we could never have planned for?
Oh, yeah. I've definitely had those moments where a chance meeting or even just a random decision I made, it completely changed my direction. The book also had that historical example, right, with the atomic bombing of Japan.
Oh, yes. The story of Henry Stimson. He was the U.S. Secretary of War during World War II. And when he was younger, he'd spent time in Kyoto, Japan. Came to really appreciate the city, its culture, all that.
Okay, but how does that connect to the bombing?
Well, fast forward to 1945, Kyoto is on the list of potential targets for the atomic bomb.
Oh, wow.
But Stimson, because of his personal connection to Kyoto, he fought to have it removed from the list, and he actually influenced Truman's decision. So this little detail from his past, it ended up shaping a world-altering event.
That is incredible. Just shows you the power of contingency. Like, who could have predicted that? That a young man's travels would have such an impact decades later in the middle of a war.
Exactly. And it highlights the limits of prediction. Some things you just can't see coming. Okay, so we've talked about why we act and where. What about who acts? Does the book talk about how uncertainty affects those in positions of power? The people making the big decisions that impact all of us.
Yeah, that's a good question. Those are the people with supposedly the most information, the most resources, right?
You'd think so. But the book emphasizes that even those at the top, they don't have the whole picture. They're still dealing with those unknown unknowns, whether they're world leaders, CEOs, or just everyday folks making decisions that affect their families. We're all grappling with the same fundamental uncertainty.
It is humbling, isn't it? No matter how much power we have, how much data, how carefully we plan, there are always things outside our control.
Exactly. Which brings us to that final element, when we act. The book doesn't go into it too deeply, but it definitely suggests that timing can be crucial when it comes to navigating uncertainty.
Oh, I can see that. Like sometimes delaying a decision, it gives you time to gather more information, right? Prevents a hasty choice you might regret. But waiting too long, you could miss an opportunity. It's like finding that sweet spot, but it's so hard to know when it is.
It is a delicate balance. There's no easy formula. But the book really emphasizes being adaptable, being flexible. We have to be ready to change course as new information comes in, as the situation evolves.
Like that saying, the only constant is change. And when the world's constantly changing, being able to adapt, being able to pivot, that becomes essential.
Absolutely. And that leads to a key takeaway from this section of the book. Those traditional decision-making models, they're useful sometimes, but they often struggle with the messy reality of uncertainty. We need new approaches, new ways of thinking about choices that take into account all these factors, contingency, how everything's interconnected, and the fact that we can't know everything.
It's like we need a new kind of map, one that accounts for those uncharted territories, those areas that are constantly changing.
Exactly. And maybe even more importantly, we need a new mindset. One that sees uncertainty not just as a problem to be solved, but as a fundamental part of the world we live in.
This whole discussion has been so thought-provoking. We've gone from just understanding uncertainty to really exploring what it means to live in a world where the unknown isn't some anomaly, it's the norm.
That's a huge shift in perspective, because once we accept that we can't know everything, that unexpected things will happen, then we can start to develop new ways of navigating this complex, unpredictable world.
And speaking of unpredictable, we haven't even touched on that fascinating story from the book about the red heifer in Israel and its connection to the end of the world.
Ah, yes, the red heifer. It takes us into some pretty wild territory. Ancient prophecies, religious beliefs, that whole human fascination with the unknown.
Okay, listeners, buckle up. This is where things get really interesting. We'll be back soon with the final part of our deep dive, where we'll unpack this whole red heifer story and connect it back to everything we've been talking about. Uncertainty, belief, how we make sense of the world. It's all coming together. Don't miss it. Okay, so that red heifer story, we got to unpack that. It's like a cow linked to the end of the world. That's wild.
Yeah, it's a bit out there, but it's a great example of how, uncertainty, when it gets mixed up with these deeply held beliefs, it can really shape how we act, what we expect, like big time.
All right, so remind me, what's the deal with this red heifer? What makes it so special?
So in some branches of Jewish tradition, right, there's this belief. They believe that a red heifer, a cow that has to meet all these very specific requirements, it's like essential for this purification ritual.
Okay. I remember that part. It's like symbolic cleansing or something.
Right, and they use the ashes from this sacrificed animal to make solution. And this solution, according to their beliefs, it's needed to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem.
Right, the temple.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to the whole end of the world thing?
Well, some people interpret those ancient texts, and they say that rebuilding the temple, it's like a prerequisite. It has to happen before the Messiah can arrive, and the Messiah, will bring about a messianic age, like peace, justice, the whole deal.
So this red heifer, it's like a key that starts this whole chain of events leading to like a total transformation of the world. That's a lot of pressure for one cow.
It is. The book doesn't say whether this is, true or not, but it uses this example to show how uncertainty can get tangled up with these belief systems, things that go way beyond what we can prove or disprove scientifically.
It makes me think about how even with all our science, all our technology, there's still these huge areas of human experience where Faith and tradition, they're still calling the shots.
Exactly. Uncertainty, it's not just about the things we don't know, it's about the meaning we make from that not knowing. The stories we tell ourselves to try and understand the mysteries of life, the universe, all of it.
I'm starting to see how this connects to our whole conversation about uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's not just about the lack of information. It's how we respond to that lack of information. We fill in the gaps with our beliefs, our values, our imagination even.
That's a really important point. And it brings us to a key idea the book makes. It says that while uncertainty can cause anxiety, fear, all that, it can also be a source of wonder, of creativity, even opportunity.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. Instead of seeing uncertainty as this thing we need to fight, we could embrace it as part of what makes us human.
Exactly. It's in that space of uncertainty that we grapple with the big questions. It fuels our curiosity, drives us to create, to search for meaning. It's a powerful force.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. We've covered so much ground, from ancient Greece to, like, modern-day economic forecasts, from secret military missions to the symbolism of a red cow. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And if there's one thing I hope you take away from all this, it's that uncertainty. It's not the enemy. It's part of being human. And learning to embrace it, well, that can make us stronger, more resilient. It can even help us grow and discover new things.
So listeners, as you go out there and navigate this complex world, remember, uncertainty, it's not something to fear. It's the very ground we walk on. It's where we create our lives, our stories, our futures. Embrace the unknown, challenge those assumptions, and never stop exploring. That's what it's all about.
Who knows, maybe you'll even stumble across a red heifer yourself.
And that's our deep dive into uncertainty. Until next